Welcome to part 4 of the Biology Paper 1 videos, where in this little session we're going to be looking at bioenergetics. So if we start over here then with kind of one of the major aspects of bioenergetics, where we're going to be looking at photosynthesis. With photosynthesis, it's really important to know the equation. So that's both the word equation, which is carbon dioxide plus water, light energy needs to be on the arrow, produces glucose plus oxygen. And we need to know the balanced symbol equation. So 6CO2 plus 6H2O produces C6H12 plus 6O2. So just to kind of emphasize the balancing thing there, we've got underline under the 3 sixes. So 6s go in front of everything apart from the glucose, which is the large C6H12O6 molecule. Now, with the photosynthesis reaction, it's important to know it's endothermic. Because it's taking in energy from the light in order for it to occur, and that energy, when it's taken in, is trapped by the chlorophyll, which is the green pigment that's found in the chloroplasts. The next thing we need to bear in mind then is the factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis. So, something for higher tier students only here is the fact that a limiting factor is going to be something that stops the reaction from going any faster at some point during the reaction. So these are the ones that are relevant to the graphs that we need to know if you're on higher tier. But just in a generalized sense, we also need to think about the 3 factors that affect it and kind of what they do to the rate. And this is relevant to foundation tier as well. So our first factor that's going to affect the rate, just like it will in any reaction, is temperature. If you increase the temperature, that will increase the rate, up until the point where the enzymes that are involved in photosynthesis could actually denature, because then obviously the rate would slow and, eventually sort of cease. So increase in temperature increases rate, but if it's too extreme, the enzymes will denature. Increasing carbon dioxide concentration will increase the rate. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward based on the fact that carbon dioxide, we can see, is one of the reactants in the equation. So if you provide more of that, it's going to proceed quicker. Light intensity as well is really important, and that one, if you increase light intensity, will increase the rate. Okay, so those are the 3 factors, and as a general rule, if you increase any of them, you're going to increase the rate. However, at some point, they could be potentially limiting factors as well. So, with the photosynthesis stuff then, there's one key practical we need to know, which is the one that you will have done with pondweed. With this practical, you're looking at kind of how light intensity affects the rate of photosynthesis. So the independent variable in this one is the light intensity, which when we did this in class, we altered it by moving the lamp set distances away from pondweed. So kind of using a ruler to do that. The dependent variable is the number of oxygen bubbles produced, or the volume of oxygen, if we're being kind of more precise about it, actually collecting that and working out the actual volume itself. So that could be done with like an inverted measuring cylinder or that type of thing. Control variables, of which there are many. Some examples would be the size and the type of pondweed, the temperature, and the concentration of carbon dioxide. So when it comes to looking at this type of practical then, there's something that higher tier students you need to know called the inverse square law. And what this states is, as you double the distance between the plant and the light source, so say the plant and the lamp, the light intensity will quarter. Okay, so it will quarter as you double the distance, the light intensity will quarter. That's worth bearing in mind. We've seen quite a few examples where that's come up in the past. So, thinking then further on about the glucose that's actually one of the main products of photosynthesis, what is this actually then used for? There's various different things. So it can be used in respiration to obviously release energy. It can be stored as starch. It can be converted into fats and oils and stored. It can be converted into cellulose, which obviously forms the cell wall of plant cells. And also it can be used to produce proteins, which are obviously really essential for growth, and to produce enzymes, because enzymes are proteins. But to do this, nitrate ions are also required, and plants obtain these from the soil typically. So that's just a few key examples for that one. So our next major part of bioenergetics then is actually respiration related stuff. So we now need to think about kind of this energy that this glucose that plants are producing, how we then as humans or animals and also the plants themselves how we use that glucose to actually release energy that's required for living things to function. So before we go any further with that, we'll just think in a general sense, why is it that organisms need energy? There's a few key things really. So they need it for chemical reactions, so to build larger molecules. They need it for movement. Obviously plants not so much for that one. And also for keeping warm, again, mainly related to animals in that example, but it's needed for lots of different things to keep living organisms alive. So looking at respiration then, respiration is an example of an exothermic reaction, because the energy transferred supplies all of the energy needed for living processes. Okay, so it's exothermic. There's a few different equations for this one that we need to know. So aerobic respiration, respiration using oxygen, is glucose plus oxygen, produces carbon dioxide plus water, and it's just worth bearing in mind, obviously, energy is going to be released in this process. So for the balanced symbol equation for that one, it's C6H12O6 plus 6O2 produces 6CO2 plus 6H2O. Again, nice and easy to balance it. It's your 3 6s that I've underlined there, in front of everything apart from the glucose. Anaerobic respiration then, so looking at this one, this is the one in animals, is using glucose to produce lactic acid and release energy in that process. So the key differences between aerobic and anaerobic is that for anaerobic there's no oxygen used, and you can see that from the word equation, and there is also much less energy transferred, so that's worth bearing in mind when you're comparing the two, so the oxygen difference and the energy transfer difference. Anaerobic respiration in plants and yeast is slightly different. Again, there's no oxygen involved, but we start off with glucose, and what is actually produced as a result is ethanol and carbon dioxide, and energy is still released in that process. Okay, so we can see it's kind of different products that are being produced, but we're still just using glucose as the only reactant. So with anaerobic respiration, this is actually really useful in terms of anaerobic respiration in yeast, because it's useful as a process which is known as fermentation, where it's really important for the production of bread and alcohol. So that's kind of a really good industry link in terms of the benefits or the uses of anaerobic respiration occurring in yeast. Moving on to the last bit of this then, so if we're looking at response to exercise, so what this is referring to is obviously during exercise the human body reacts to the increased demand for energy. So a couple of things will happen in response to that, in that heart rate will increase, breathing rate will increase, and breath volume will increase. The reason this happens is to supply the muscles with more oxygenated blood for respiration. If insufficient oxygen is present, what will happen is the body will respire anaerobically, so without oxygen, like we looked up above, and what then happens as a consequence is obviously we get this build-up of lactic acid that's produced, and that creates something called an oxygen debt. Okay, so this is kind of in response to quite vigorous exercise, where you end up respiring anaerobically. For higher tier students, we need to understand what's actually going to happen as a result of this lactic acid buildup and this oxygen debt. So with regard to the lactic acid, that actually is converted back into glucose eventually in the liver. So that's really important, obviously, because that needs to be broken down because it creates cramps and things like that once you've exercised. And the oxygen debt, what that is referring to is the amount of extra oxygen that the body needs after exercise so that it can react that oxygen with the lactic acid and remove it from cells. Okay, so post-exercise, because of lactic acid buildup, you need a certain amount of oxygen to enter the body to react with that lactic acid to remove it and get rid of it. Okay, the final section then for this bioenergetics topic, looking at metabolism. So just a brief overview really for this one here. So what metabolism is talking about is it's the sum of all the reactions in a cell or the body. So some good examples of things that are involved in metabolism are the conversion of glucose to starch, glycogen or cellulose. So these are some bigger carbohydrate molecules that glucose sugars get turned into. the formation of lipid molecules from glycerol and fatty acids, the use of glucose and nitrate ions to form amino acids, which obviously then are used to produce proteins. Just move that up slightly there, it's a bit difficult to see. So again, sorry, just to repeat that one, the use of glucose and nitrate ions to form amino acids, which then obviously are the foundations of producing a protein. Proteins obviously really important throughout the body, especially enzymes. Respiration is part of metabolism, and finally the breakdown of proteins, which produces urea, which is a waste product that then the body obviously gets rid of. Okay, so that's just a few key examples of things that are involved in metabolism. So that's it really for bioenergetics. The main things to remember for that one primarily are your photosynthesis equations and aerobic and anaerobic respiration equations. Okay, and then just kind of the little bits that go around that.